Hi everybody, welcome back to Happy Little Diodes. I've been busy scouring eBay and Facebook Marketplace for broken speckies, and I came across this bargain which was for sale locally, so picked it up after work. Let's have a look what we can do with it. It's definitely broken, the owner told me so, and it's not in the best condition. You see the faceplate is lifting up. There's some sort of weird sticky tape marks all over it, I think where somebody has tried to repair it in the past. The screws are showing a little bit of rust, so I don't think it's been kept in the best possible condition. None of this should stop us getting it up and running though, so hopefully by the end of this video we'll have a repaired and serviced Spectrum, playing games and good to go for another however many decades. We're going to focus on the electronic repair. We're not too fussed about this one cosmetically because I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Maybe it will just become a workhorse. So let's open it up. This is always the exciting bit. You don't know what issue board you're going to get in there. I've heard of people finding issue 1s inside cases that don't look like issue 1s. I'm just hoping it's not an issue 2 because they're a pain. And it's an issue 3B. That's not too bad. It doesn't have those annoying variable resistors that make the picture go all yellow. It does mean we're going to need to do a DC-DC mod to the power circuit to bring it up to standard. But that's okay, that's bread and butter for us at this point. Sadly, and take note of this for later, it is a ULA ending in a 6, and that's never a good sign. Those ULAs do tend to die, but we'll come to that later. First thing I'm going to do is get this heatsink off so I can work on the board, and be mindful from this point onwards not to run the board for very long because that voltage regulator will overheat and die without the heatsink applied. First things first, and this should be really the first thing you do with the board that you don't know anything about, especially if it's from Marketplace and it's sold as broken. We're going to check the resistance from the 3 voltage supplies to the lower RAM all the way to ground. So I've got the negative probe of my multimeter clamped onto the 7805 in the top right there. And I'm just going to probe the 4 corner pins of the lower RAM chips. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what numbers I'm looking for here. I'm just looking for not 0 or not very low. And that seemed good to me, which is a good sign. So let's plug it in and check the current draw. We're getting about 0.58 amps. That's also looking pretty good. I had the current limit on the power supply set to less than 1 amp, by the way. Alright, voltages. There's our 5 volts. We're looking for 12 volts. Also looks good. And minus 5 volts. Close enough. I'm doing this quite quickly because, like I mentioned before, there's no heatsink on there. Next thing I want to know is what kind of video output are we getting? There is a way to just hold a composite cable against the modulator to get a picture, but I'm going to do a composite mod anyway on this, so we might as well do it properly at this point. We've done this a million times before. There is a guide linked below from an earlier video, but basically we're going to disconnect the jack. We're going to desolder these 2 pins that feed into the modulator. And I tend to carefully remove them like this with a screwdriver and some heat applied to the joint after removing as much solder as I can with the solder sucker. Neatly fold those wires over the casing. This way you can always reverse the mod if you want to. And we're going to take a 100 microfarad 16 volt capacitor and pop it in like so. This is always the fiddliest bit of a composite mod with a capacitor like this, but keep it neat, otherwise you might impede the plug going into the jack, which I have done before. Lovely. Right. Let's plug in the video cable and see what we're getting on the screen. Okay, answers on a postcard. What do we think is broken here? My guess is RAM. Based on those red vertical lines, it's getting partway through the memory test on boot up and failing. We're going to need to run it for a while now while we probe around and investigate, so heatsink's going back on. That way we don't need to worry about things overheating. I'm going to use this Standinator with a built-in diagnostic ROM to see if we can figure out which RAM chip is going wrong, if that is in fact the problem. Well, it looks like the external ROM can't run, or, well, it's trying to run, but it's really not going very well. See these green flashing borders and the red flashing border? That is trying to tell me which RAM chip it thinks has gone wrong. It looks like the fourth one in there from that last screen. Before I do anything drastic though, I'm going to clean the edge connector and run it again. Maybe it was just the ROM didn't have good contacts. Fiberglass pen does such a good job here, I really recommend getting one. Just give the whole thing a bit of a clean with some alcohol and a toothbrush afterwards to get rid of all the dust. Look at that, beautiful, all shiny and new. Rerunning the diagnostic ROM still looked the same, but it decided it was a different RAM chip causing problems, and then started to go really crazy. So I'm starting to think it's not just a RAM chip, or it might not be a RAM chip at all causing the problem here. More likely it would be the CPU, I reckon. Probing around, I saw all kinds of issues on the data and address lines. Amplitudes too small, some with no activity at all, some just totally wrong. The clock signals look good from the ULA, and it's producing a video, so I didn't want to swap the ULA out just yet. Should have, by the way, because I'm about to waste a lot of time replacing this Z80. But anyway, here's what I did, got the Z80 out. This one was a tough customer as well. It did not want to come out gracefully, and it was very hard to resist the urge to pry it. Never pry it if you're tempted. Always get all the pins free first, and then you can lift it out like this with almost no force. Little bit of a tidy up of these tiny bits of solder left in the joint, so that the socket will slot in easily. Here's our brand spanking new Z80 to go in. And this was the point where I triumphantly plugged it in, and it did exactly the same thing it was doing before. This is sad news because the ULAs aren't easily replaced these days, they just don't make them anymore. But that's the way it is. This guy is dead and is going into the pile of broken chips, which is getting bigger and bigger. Not all hope is lost for the ULAs ending in a 6. Some of them have still worked for me, so don't throw them out immediately, always test them first. Here's my spare ULA. It is a ULA ending in a 7, and that's a good one. If you open up a machine and there's one of those in, chances are it's fine. This one's already got a heatsink on, so I'm going to have to remove the socket for the ULA if I'm going to put the case back around it. But there we go, there's the evidence. ULA was the problem, and fortunately the RAM chips are all okay. So let's get down to business. Standard procedure, we're going to replace all the capacitors, and we're going to do a DC-DC modification to the power circuit. As you know, if you've been watching this channel in the past, I like to do this job with the board in a vise. I don't see a problem doing this. It's a little bit unconventional, I suppose, but it doesn't have to make it easier to remove these components. You can just apply heat on one side and pull them out on the other side. You obviously just need to be careful not to over tighten the vise and cause more problems for yourself. Here are our brand new caps, all blue of course. We'll be replacing all of them but one because the DC mod removes one, so don't waste your time replacing that one if you're going to do power circuit modification after recapping. Okay, there we go, new capacitors all around. You'll notice I haven't replaced one of them, this one, because the next thing we're going to do is the DC modification. This is quite an involved mod, link below to a video where I talk you through it. It happens entirely in the bottom right of the board here, and we're going to do some funky stuff here, replacing components, dropping diodes in resistor slots on the board. It's fairly complex, but I think necessary because you just don't want transistors to be blowing. You want this thing to last as long as possible. Here's how it looks after the modification. First thing to do after this is check the voltages, which were all fine. Of course, there's more than one way to do this. This is just the way I like to do it. Okay, I want to run the ULA with a heatsink, and I want to run this inside a rubber key case, which means I need to take the socket out for the ULA and solder the new one directly to the board. If you're eagle-eyed, you might realise that this is a different ULA to the one I tested earlier. Found a few tested old stock on eBay, lucky me. So I'm going to pop one of these in, put it to work. I like to solder these chips in a bit of a crisscross pattern, so I'm not just smashing heat into one area of the chip. I don't know how effective this is or if it actually prevents any damage, but it seems like a good idea to me. Before we go any further, I popped in a new keyboard member in, the old one was broken, cleaned up this rubber key mat, and I'm going to stick the faceplate back down because we saw earlier it was lifting. There is a brass tab or two left on this. Someone has removed the other two, or at least broken them, so let's get some double-sided tape over there and stick the whole thing down. That's looking pretty good. So that's all the work I want to do to the board here. I'm going to power it up and run some soak tests. What this does is it fairly intensively tests the lower and then upper RAM and just repeats the process over and over again. It's a good idea to do it, let the Spectrum get warm. I accidentally ran this for a long time and I was getting on for 2000 test iterations, which is definitely the longest I've accidentally ran it for, but gives me a lot of confidence that the board is working very stably. Last thing to do, get that heatsink on. That should hopefully give the ULA slightly longer life. And finally put the whole thing back together again and play some games. Let's go with Treasure Island Dizzy, which I still haven't finished. Some of you might remember streaming this live. We made some progress, maybe I'll get back on and give it another crack soon. The moral of this story is the ULA is the easiest chip to replace if you have a spare, so just check that that's not the issue before you start desoldering massive chips. Thanks so much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share.